So I worked a lot this week, and what I was going to talk about, I needed more time, so I decided rather than subjecting you to something that really needed a lot more work, we'd talk about something that is a little bit different and a little bit easier to go through. Most of you have come to the place by now where you realize that I'm studying to become an Old Testament scholar, and so everything that I do is going to be birthed back there. And the way that I summarize this is to say there's one Bible, and the New Testament is a commentary on that Bible. Okay, and so to understand what's going on in the New Testament, we have to understand what's going on in the Hebrew Bible, because it's all commentary. Every story, every preaching, every metaphor, everything refers back to what they called their scriptures. Okay, and so they're not doing this out of nothing. They're not just making doctrine up. They're not just, oh, this guy did some things, he must be important. No, it all relates back to this, what we Old Testament, right? But I prefer the term Hebrew Bible. I think it's more respectful to what it actually is. It's the Bible. Having said that, I'm going to talk about some stuff in the New Testament today. But we have to start in the Old because this is where it finds its genesis. Get it? I got a few laughs at the dad church joke. Okay, so I am of the persuasion that Jesus is God. And this might be like groundbreaking for some of you, but there's actually a rather large and heated debate among scholars as to whether this is what the Bible is actually saying or not. Okay, and the Jesus as God theology did come around a little bit later, okay? It comes around with the church, and they begin to work it out, and that's just what happens, right? We don't know what a prophet is until after we've stoned them, usually. And Luke has something really good to say about that. My Hebrew teacher showed me this verse, and it's become my favorite verse. And it says, he says, you build shrines to the prophets your fathers murdered. Meaning, you don't know. You kill them and then you realize, oh crap, they were holy and they were correct and they were speaking something that we needed. Okay, and this is just kind of how it works. But, so let's dig into let's give you the very concise version of where I've come in this argument, and then we'll get into what I'm going to say, because to me, what I'm going to say doesn't matter until we get this point down, right? And I believe that what the gospel writers are doing in their literary style and what Paul is doing in his theology is they are very subtly and sometimes not so subtly saying Jesus is God. Okay, and again, like I would get ripped to shreds in the scholarly community by about half of it for that statement, but there's also good evidence to my side. So we can make this statement and feel okay about that from a scientific point of view if we want to talk about it that way. But essentially, I arrived there because Yahweh in the Old Testament is Adonai, which is the Hebrew word for Lord. And when they translate this Hebrew word for Lord into Greek, they use kurios when the Septuagint guys are translating the Old Testament. And kurios is the Greek word for Lord. And so when they're saying Jesus is kurios, I think sometimes they're being Hellenistic and they're saying Jesus is Lord as in Caesar is Lord. And I think sometimes they're being very Hebrew in saying Jesus is Lord as in Jesus is that guy. Okay, and it's not 100% of the time, and that's where you usually get into the debate is when are they actually saying this and when are they not? Sometimes it is just a title. Okay, but other times it is very much indicative of the name that the Jews aren't allowed to say or don't say out of respect. Okay, so that's the short of it. Jesus is Lord can mean Jesus is Yahweh. Okay. And that's important for me. Ooh. It's going to be like in your kind of like mid-range and stuff. Yeah, I know. I just channeled my dad. I told you to change something and I stopped talking. Next, I'll cry. Hold on. I'm just kidding. That's important for me because if Jesus is just a good guy, then why the hell do I want to emulate him? He died. Like, they murdered him for his stance. And if he's just a good teacher and a good guy, like, why on earth would I want to be following that? Like, that way leads to death, folks. Like, there's no reason that I should logically want to follow that, okay? So, if I then take the stance, well, maybe it is that Emmanuel, which means God with us, was the plan all along. And the message is incarnation, not impregnation, right? God became a baby. God didn't have sex with a woman. And so we tend to kind of blur these lines, especially in the English language. and so it's just something that I think it's always good to refresh this in us, right? What we're actually saying as Christians is that we believe Jesus is God, okay? Not Son of God, even though that's true too, okay? But God. Incarnation, Emmanuel, in that day I will walk among them and I will be their God and they will be my people. This is all throughout the Old Testament. You know, it's like a bunch of times, I won't say a number because someone will be like, no, you're wrong. But there's some times, like a dozen or so, where Yahweh says, in that day I will be their God and they will be my people and I will walk among them. And this is just kind of the story, okay? And you can't get to the Messiah without the Second Temple era, but we're not going to talk about that now. You're just not going to find Messiah in the Old Testament. That doesn't happen. That all comes from the Second Temple writings in the so-called silent years. So if you want to know about Messiah, you have to study Second Temple writing, not Bible, okay? But we're going to bypass all that, and I'm going to say there are about 2 years of various rabbit trails we need to take to get all that information, so I can just give you some resources if you want them later. But what I want to do is talk a bit about Jesus' table fellowship. Jesus with an apostrophe at the end. So his table fellowship. Okay, and what this means and why it's important and why we should actually take note of all the seemingly unimportant meals that he eats throughout the Bible. Okay? So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to read, 5 or 6 quotes from different scholars, just kind of like setting the stage so that you don't have to take my word for it, but so that you can understand, okay, this is why table fellowship was a big deal. First one is from a guy named Norman Perrin. First, what he does, he has this book called Rediscovering the Teachings of Jesus, and very mundane, but a lot of good stuff to say. And what he does is he establishes the ground for the fact that it's a really, really serious thing for a Jew to turn over a fellow countryman to Rome. Okay, and so for them to hand Jesus over to Rome to be crucified is a very, very serious thing. This isn't common. Okay, it's not what they did. They usually took care of their own matters, and Rome let them. You know, they had laws that people were to be stoned for certain things, and Rome was fine with that. You know, don't start a fight in the province. Just do your thing. That's fine. Okay? So he says, there must have been a factor in the situation which both drove the authorities themselves to desperate measures and also gave them a defense against popular accusation. We suggest that regular table fellowship in the name of the kingdom of God between Jesus and his followers, when those followers included Jews who had made themselves as Gentiles, would have been just such a factor. Okay? So Perrin is saying what he thinks is that what really pissed off the religious leaders was who Jesus chose to eat with. Okay? And when he says those Jews who have made themselves as Gentiles, there was actually a process in the era where people would try to uncircumcise themselves because they worked out naked and they didn't want to go to the workout and be seen for what they were, children of Abraham. So these are Jews who made themselves as Gentiles. They undid their circumcision. That's the covenant between God and Israel. Okay, so that's a serious offense, right? Joachim Jeremias, in the Eucharistic words of Jesus, says, and he calls it Oriental, but what he means is like the ancient Near East and into like some of the Far East in this time. So just the word Oriental is kind of anachronistic to where we are now. But he says, for the Oriental, every table fellowship is a guarantee of peace, of trust, and of brotherhood. Table fellowship is a fellowship of life. Table fellowship with Jesus is more. This becomes especially evident in the case of that table fellowship which Jesus celebrated with sinners and outcasts. The Oriental, to whom symbolic action means more than it does to us, would immediately understand the acceptance of outcasts into table fellowship with Jesus as an offer of salvation to guilty sinners and as assurance of forgiveness. Hence the passionate objections of the Pharisees, who held that the pious could have table fellowship only with the righteous. Okay? So what he's saying is, and like, he's translated from German, so that's why some of the words are kind of funky. But basically what he's saying is, the fact that he sat down to eat with people meant he considered them under his protection. You know, he considered what they did not an issue, and he considered them part of his family, brotherhood. Okay, this isn't like brotherhood like motorcycles. This is like brotherhood like sibling. Okay? Again, this is Joachim Jeremias. I'm going to keep quoting him a couple more times. And this is from his book, New Testament Theology. He said, these gatherings at tables, which provoke such scandal because Jesus excluded no one from them, even open sinners, and which thus express the heart of his message, were types of the feast to come in the time of salvation. And this is where you'd have to get into some Second Temple writing to understand what he's getting at there, but there's this messianic feast, and people are all included in this feast, and you know, the vision of the Messiah as it comes from the end of the Old Testament into the Second Temple era is very, very, very universalistic. Okay? And we can't get around that. And that's not universalism as we're talking about today, but the idea is that God is the God of all, whether they want to acknowledge that or not. Okay? That's just, they finally arrive at this point in their spiritual evolution where they say, oh, he's the God of all life. Okay? Marcus Borg, in Conflict, Holiness, and Politics in the Teaching of Jesus, says, within Judaism, the significance of table fellowship was even greater. In it came to focus the cultural dynamics of holiness, of which the Pharisees were preeminently the bearers. For the Pharisees, the meal had become a microcosm of Israel's intended historic structure, as well as a model of Israel's destiny. In the meal converged these two streams of halakhic, which is teaching, halakhic development, which dominated the quest after holiness, tithing and purity. Okay, these are the two things that dominated the quest for holiness in the Pharisees and why the meals are going to be affected. Okay, tithing and purity. You're required to tithe off of your meal. Yes. You're required to tithe off the bread that's on your table. Okay? And purity is hand washing, and Pharisees are not going to like... Again, another like Second Temple / rabbinic doctrine is that handling certain texts makes the hands unclean because they're clean and you're not, and so you have to wash after you handle these texts. Hi. So then he goes on and he says, Jesus denied the equation of holiness with separation. And we've all heard this, right? Holy means separate and set apart. Bull. And Jesus is the reason, bull. Because he erases that equation. He says, no. Holiness and separation aren't the same thing. Okay? Jeremias outlines for us in this historical book called Jerusalem at the Time of Jesus, and it's like a really, really, really long, mundane list of things at the time of Jesus that Jerusalem was all about. It's like if someone were to chronicle all the city workers of Fort Collins. Seriously, I mean, this is what this book, and it's just like, but again, we need what's in there because we have to understand the social context that Jesus is in, right? So he outlines all these despised trades. This is what he calls them. This is what they're known for. And he pulls them from Mishnaic and Talmudic traditions. Livestock drivers, sailors, herdsmen, shopkeepers, physicians, butchers, dung collectors, copper smelter, tanner, goldsmith, flax comber, handmill cleaner, weaver, peddler, barber, launderer, bloodletter, bath attendant, gambler with dice, usurer, pigeon trainer, dealer in produce of the sabbatical year, tax collector, publican. Okay. Some of those are synonymous. And what's left? It's like, what else is there? Well, there's itinerant teacher. That's not on there. Pastor's not on there. Worship leader's not on there. For a reason. No, and so a lot of these trades are quote-unquote despised because of the inherent dishonesty involved in them. Okay, like the gold smelter was always tempted to add something to the mix and siphon a little off for themselves. And that's the same with like the coppersmith. But you'll notice like things like fishermen aren't on here. Seamstress isn't on here. You know, so there are trades that are, the cook isn't on here. What does a butcher do? A butcher butchers the meat and keeps the best part for himself and gives you the one that he says is the best part. Oh, no, that's the best one. You know, and he keeps the part you want really for himself. I mean, this is the thought. This is why they're considered dishonorable trades or despised trades. You'll also notice that prostitute is not in there. So when we want to talk about Jesus eating with sinners, we got to leave prostitute off the list. Because class of sinner, I mean, this is like a recognizable group of society at this time. Sinners. This isn't everyone. It takes Christianity later to call everybody a sinner. This is a recognizable group. Sinners referred to somebody that everybody knew. Okay, it wasn't like, well, who's in this group, Lord? No, they knew. You know, and there were specific ones. And then finally, I'm going to read a quote by Dahl. And I pulled this from Perrin's book, but it's just so good. He says, any historical understanding of the ministry of Jesus must make sense of the fact that that ministry ended with the cross. Meaning, that's the culmination of whatever we want to talk about Jesus' ministry being, it has to come there. And so if it doesn't end there, we're kind of off base. Okay, so all of that is all of my foundation to say table fellowship is important at this time. It's not like we do today where it's like, hey, you want to go out to lunch? And we go out and we go Dutch. And we might talk about our week a little bit, but we don't really ever go in depth because there's other people over there and we can't be too open. You know, and we got to get home because the kids are all tired and they want a nap and they're grumpy. Or dad is grumpy because he wants a nap. Me, dad, not them. It's different. Okay, now what we're going to do is a katina, which is a really better word for a group of proof texts. Because we've been taught not to proof text, so what we're going to do is proof text, but we're going to call it a katina. That way I don't get in trouble. We're going to mostly be in Luke, but we're going to also be in the other Gospels a little bit. And we're just going to be in the Gospels talking about Jesus and table fellowship, okay? So in let's start with Matthew 9. And these won't be up on the screen, so if you have a Bible, you'll have to go there. Matthew 9 to 13, and I'm not reading from a version that anyone has probably, so if the words don't match up, it's okay. Matthew 9 says, and as Jesus was going away from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth and said to him, follow me. And he stood up and followed him. And it happened as he was dining in the house, behold, many tax collectors and sinners were coming and dining with Jesus and his disciples. And again, this doesn't mean tax collectors and prostitutes. This means tax collectors and people that are in that group of despised trades known as sinners. Okay? And people who willingly violated Israel's laws. Those are sinners too. And when they saw it, the Pharisees began to say to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" And when he heard it, he said, "Those who are healthy do not have need of a physician, but those who are sick. But go and learn what it means, 'I want mercy and not sacrifice.' For I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners." Okay, I'm not going to do too much here other than to show that we listed tax collector as among the group of despised trades. And this is Jesus calling Matthew to be a disciple, who is a member of one of those people. Okay, so his first table fellowship is with a tax collector. If we want to put that in today's terms, he's sitting down with a government worker. But not just a government worker, one that says he's not a part of the government, but really he is. When he says, "I want mercy and not sacrifice," mercy is the Greek word eleos, and eleos is how they always translate hesed in the Old Testament, and hesed is one of my favorite Hebrew words, and it always gets translated like mercy or faithfulness, but it has to do with God's enduring mercy and ever-present faithfulness. And he says, "This is what I desire and not sacrifice." Okay? And what sacrifice is he talking about there? Is he talking about the sacrificial system? No, he's talking about don't worry about tithing and washing your hands. This is not what this is about. This story gets repeated in Mark 2:15-17, and then Luke expands it a bit. And there's some debate among scholars as to which one of these stories is legitimate. Maybe they both are. Maybe this is why they got recorded this way. But you'll notice that there's only a little bit of difference between this one and the one about Matthew, but it just happens to be about Levi instead. So Luke 5:27-32 says, "And after these things, he went out and saw a tax collector named Levi sitting at the tax booth. And he said to him, 'Follow me.' And leaving everything behind, he got up and began to follow him. And Levi gave a great banquet for him in his house, and there was a large crowd of tax collectors and others who were reclining for the meal with them. And the Pharisees and their scribes began to complain to his disciples, saying, 'Why do you eat and drink with the tax collectors and sinners?'" Now, I would like to interject here. When we read in a gospel, the Pharisees were complaining, we should take that as the opinion of the author and not fact. Okay? Probably the Pharisees said, right? Complaint is something that an author does to describe what it sounded like. Okay? So these are little tricks that you can start learning to read the Bible instead of just looking at the words on the page. And the Pharisees get a bad rap. They're not bad people. Okay, they're not evil legalists who want everybody to commit sacrifices. They want Israel to not live in exile anymore, and they're trying to do whatever they can to make that happen. That's not a bad goal. Okay? Motives are good, brain power probably not so much. And the Pharisees and their scribes begin to complain to his disciples, saying, "Why do you eat and drink with the tax collectors and sinners?" And Jesus answered and said to them, "Those who are healthy do not have need of a physician, but those who are also sick. Thick people need they need either help or something. Yeah. I've not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." Okay, so similar story. Leaves a couple things out. "I desire mercy and not sacrifice." He leaves that out. Changes the name. It's Levi instead of Matthew. We can go into some of this later, but it's, Luke does some things because Luke's trying to make a point. And so that's that. Anytime you've got something that appears in 3 Gospels, and Mark is one of them, Mark was first. So it's highly, highly likely that Luke or Matthew copied and changed Mark's story. Okay? And we don't need to worry about that. If you have questions about that, we can just go through the list of all the discrepancies between the 4 Gospels on things like dating and things like what day of the week things happen and things like things even happening, because some Gospels don't record things happening that others do, and there's certain things that are only in the book of John that aren't anywhere else. And so it's I don't think we need to get caught up in all that. I think this is what we do when we write stories about people that we love, and we just remember the parts that we remember, even if they're not totally factual. Okay? Luke 7:36-39 says, "Now one of the Pharisees asked him to eat with him, and he entered into the house of the Pharisee and reclined at the table. And behold, a woman in the town who was a sinner, when she learned that he was dining in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster flask of perfumed oil. And standing behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears, and was wiping them with the hair of her head, and was kissing his feet and anointing them with the perfumed oil. Now when a Pharisee who invited him saw this, he spoke to himself, saying, If this man were a prophet, he would have known who and what kind of woman this is who is touching him, that she is a sinner." Note again, this does not say she is a prostitute. This story gets so butchered from the pulpit. This is just a woman who happens to fall into that class of people known as sinners, which includes a lot of trades, and none of them are prostitutes. Okay? So here we have the first instance where Jesus is going somewhere that isn't a tax collector, a government worker, and he goes to a Pharisee. Oh, Lord, this isn't right. You mean he eats with Southern Baptists too? No, Southern Baptists aren't Pharisees. That's funny for some grace people. No, Pharisees are religious leaders. They didn't hold much political power at this time. Some people try to conflate it and say they did, but they didn't. Okay, it was a different time. In Jesus' time, not much political power. Okay, a lot of religious power, which is very close in all time. So not only is he eating with a Pharisee here, but he's allowed a woman who is a sinner to come into the meal and to anoint his feet with very expensive oil. Okay? So where did she get that oil? Maybe she stole it. Maybe that's why she's a sinner. You know, you don't know. The text doesn't give us that. We just get the word sinner. Okay? Luke 11:37-38. "And as he was speaking, a Pharisee asked him to have a meal with him, and he went in and reclined at a table. And the Pharisee, when he saw it, was astonished that he did not first wash before the meal." Okay, guy's not impressed that this itinerant preacher who has a huge following is eating at his house. He's impressed that he didn't wash his hands. He's like, whoa, 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 whoa. Purity is important. You must be pure to dine at my table. Mark 14:3 says, "And while he was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, as he was reclining for a meal, a woman came holding an alabaster flask of very costly perfumed oil of genuine nard. After breaking the alabaster flask, she poured it out on his head." So apparently this happened more than once. And one time it's at a Pharisee's house, but another time he's eating at a leper's house. Are you allowed to touch or be around a leper? No. Are you allowed to be in the home of a leper? No. You are unclean. The question floated around Facebook a couple days ago, was Jesus unclean? Yes. According to the Mosaic and Levitical law, yes. He did some things that, that would have made him unclean. Now, what we don't have is, we do have record that Mary is going to offer her sacrifice for her cleanliness after Jesus is born. So it's like some people like to think, oh, Jesus is born, the sacrificial system went away. Not really. In fact, it was still going on until about 30 years after his death. And then it got wiped out. So he's here with a leper, and this one doesn't say that the woman was a sinner. Just a woman. Just a woman came in and poured this thing on his head. Not his feet. She's not weeping. She's not using her hair to dry him. She's just anointing him. I'm sure there's a lot of symbolism here, and we're not going to go into it. John 12, verses 1-3, there's another time that Jesus comes to Bethany, and again, this looks like it might be even a different occurrence. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. So they made him a dinner there, and Martha was serving, but Lazarus was one of the ones reclining at the table with him. Then Mary took a pound of ointment, a very valuable, genuine nard, and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the ointment. So here you have kind of a blending of the two stories. Right? So it's like, obviously something like this happened. Are all three of these stories 100% historically factually correct? Who knows? Can't verify it, but it seems like they're borrowing from each other pretty heavily. However, whenever John says something, scholars take note because the synoptics depend on each other. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they kind of depend on each other. Like I said, Mark wrote, and then Matthew and Luke edited Mark's writing, basically. John is totally separate, written at a different time, in a different location, by a different person. And when there's things that overlap in John and the synoptics, you can pretty well be assured that something like this actually did happen. Okay? And I know none of you are skeptics, but, for those of us who approach things with a more skeptical mindset from time to time, it's good to have that kind of footing. Like, okay, so here we are. So, Jesus has raised Lazarus from the dead. There's not many rules about how you hang out with those people in the Old Testament. Like, thou shalt not eat dinner with a zombie. That doesn't happen. So there's no precedent here, so Jesus isn't really doing anything wrong. Lazarus is alive. He's not dead. It's fine. But here it's Mary, the sister of Martha and Lazarus, who takes the ointment, pours it on his head. Pours it on his feet. So if we take the other verse, then it's calling Mary, the sister of Martha, a sinner. Right? Like, we don't have to conflate these two, but if we do, this is something we might be able to say. Luke 19, 1 through 10. This is a little longer. And it's a little longer because of who it talks about. This person has a special affinity for me. And he entered and traveled through Jericho, and there was a man named Zacchaeus. And he was a chief tax collector, and he was rich. Those aren't the things that speak to me. And he was seeking to see Jesus, who he was, and he was not able to see as a result of the crowd because he was short in stature. Yeah. And he ran on ahead and climbed up into a sycamore tree so that he could see him. I used to have friends that would tell me, Caleb, go find a sycamore tree so you can see things. Jerks. Because he was going to go through that way. And when he came to the place, Jesus looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, come down quickly, because it is necessary for me to stay at your house today. And he came down quickly and welcomed him joyfully. And when they saw it, they all began to complain, saying, he has gone in to find lodging with a man who is a sinner. Lodging. This isn't just dinner. He's going to stay there. Jesus in a house of ill repute? And Zacchaeus stopped and said to the Lord, behold, half of my possessions, Lord, I am giving to the poor. And if I have extorted anything from anyone, I am paying it back 4 times as much. And Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house because he too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and save those who are lost. We'll deal with that part later. But here's Zacchaeus, another tax collector, but not just a tax collector, the tax collector. Like he's head of the Fed. Right? He's Steve Mnuchin. Okay? Except for that guy's probably taller. He's the guy that everybody took their ill-gotten taxes to. They had already skimmed off the top, and guess what he's going to do too? He's going to skim right off of that. Okay? Chief tax collector, and he was rich. And I don't care what you say, Jesus has a problem with the rich. We don't like that. It's uncomfortable. It's very uncomfortable. I'm not saying if you're rich today, Jesus has a problem with you. No. I'm saying when he's doing his ministry, he has a problem with the rich because they are the ones who are controlling everything. and they are not going to give that control up. Okay? And I mean, in today's world, we think, oh, so-and-so has X amount of dollars, they're rich. But like on the scale of the wealth that is available to the people who are actually the top 10%, it's not even close. You're a pauper. There is a level of wealth that I think is unjust, and I think that God thinks is unjust, and that Jesus seemed to have an issue with, even though he doesn't exclude that person, right? He goes into their house. But it's not going to be brought out in the text that this guy was rich unless that's important, right? That's an unnecessary detail if that isn't an issue. Okay. Luke 7, 1-9, and this is going to be our last little verse here. It says, after he had finished all his sayings in the hearing of the people, he went to Capernaum. Now a centurion had a servant who was sick and at the point of death, who was highly valued by him. When the centurion heard about Jesus, he sent to him elders of the Jews, asking him to come and heal his servant. And when they came to Jesus, they pleaded with him earnestly, saying, he is worthy to have you do this for him, for he loves our nation, and he is the one who built us our synagogue. And Jesus went with them. When he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends, saying to him, Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. Therefore I did not presume to come to you, but say the word, and let my servant be healed. For I too am a man set under authority, with soldiers under me. I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my servant, do this, and he does it. When Jesus heard these things, he marveled at him, and turning to the crowd that followed him, said, I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith. And when those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the servant well. Now, this story seems a little odd to throw in here, but the point of the story is that Jesus is on his way to the centurion's house. He doesn't say, no, sorry, I can't have fellowship with you because you're a supremacist. He's on his way to the house. And, supremacist, you're using... No, Rome was absolutely supremacist. Like, they wanted to control the world. You can't get much more than that. And they were actively doing so, very, very violently. And they were occupying all kinds of foreign lands, and they were murdering people, and they were raping people, and they were crucifying people. And yet, one of the captains of the supremacist army calls for Jesus to heal his servant, not even a kid. And Jesus is like, yeah, let's do it. And he's going to this guy's house. Man, that ain't going to fly today. What are you doing going to their house? Okay, so we're going to get out of here a little bit earlier today. Praise Jesus. Woo. That is not in any way all of the meals that appear in the Gospels. Okay, there's also the Last Supper. And at the Last Supper, at a minimum, you've got Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Peter, Andrew, James, Simon, Judas, Thomas, Bartholomew, and Philip. Minimum. Probably more. But these are the ones we know. Okay? Matthew's a tax collector. Mark, unknown. Luke is a doctor. Peter's a fisherman and also a liar. Right? I don't know him. Andrew's a fisherman. James and John are fishermen, but they're probably more like business owners because they're tending the nets. They've got a crew. Right? Okay? I mean, this is speculation, but that's something that there are a couple scholars that say that. Simon the Canaanite, I mean, we already know about that, right? Canaanites are evil, and they were wiped out by Joshua, but Simon is one. He's a zealot. And the zealots were anarchists who were like really striving for the violent overthrow of the government. Like they wanted Messiah to come in and lay waste to Rome. This wasn't about, oh, you're born as a baby? No. For a zealot to follow after Jesus, kind of a big deal. Judas is a treasurer. By tradition, he's also called a thief, but people don't know if that's just because they wanted to slander the guy that betrayed Jesus. But the Bible does say he's a thief. So at least by tradition, Judas is a treasurer who's also a thief. We don't have any of those in the church today. Right? But we throw him out. He's also a betrayer. Thomas, his profession is unknown, but I mean, come on. We all know what his real name is. Right? It's Doubting Thomas. Doubt is a sin. No. I think Thomas' story is thrown in there to help those of us who are skeptical. Right? God's like, dude, I got you too. You're fine. You can be a skeptic. I'll just give you a wound to poke. Bartholomew is unknown. Philip is a tradesman, but Philip is Greek. Philip's a Gentile. So at the Last Supper, we've got liars, thieves, Greeks. There are some prostitutes. I mean, this is a good old-fashioned party, right? And Jesus is there, and he's breaking bread. And he's saying, this is the blood of my covenant to these people. These are the people he's sitting with, not the religious elite. He's not with the pastor of the church over in Galatia trying to schedule his next meeting. He's sitting with people that pastor at the church in Galatia would probably disassociate from him for. Well, I can't eat with you. You eat with them. Then we've got these two times where Jesus feeds a whole lot of people. Okay? The way to translate the Greek 4,000 and 5,000 in these stories is too many for us to count. There's a lot of people there. We don't know. 4,000, that sounds like a good number. That's as high as I know. It's not like they did like we do. And when you walk into church, could you please check in with our app so that we know you're there? We don't do that here. We're like Jesus. No, this is just, they're not trying to bloat his ministry either. Oh, well, Jesus had 5,000, you who had 4,500 at your last service. And I'm his right-hand man. But let's just say that there's a whole mess of people there, if we're in the South. And Jesus manages to feed a whole mess of people without telling them, Rome is the reason you're hungry. It's the oppression of Rome that's led you here hungry. No, he feeds them and presumably sits there and eats with them. That's a huge table fellowship. He's eating with 5,000 random people. He didn't have any idea what some of them are. You mean he ate with religious leaders? Yeah. I think some of them changed their robes. Put on the peasant robes and they'd go out and listen to his things. He gives the best meals. Fish and bread? 60% of the diet for Israel in the Old Testament, 60% of the caloric intake is bread and wine. Amen. And beer if you're in Mesopotamia because the climate isn't right to grow grapes. Amen. Maybe they hadn't mastered the fine art of IPAs yet, but there's beer in the Old Testament. I wonder how many of these so-called despised traditions were among the crowd that Jesus sat there and not only fed but ate with. So, this is a setting for Luke 15 when he gives the parables. Lost sheep, lost coin, lost son, right? They're mad at him for eating with tax collectors and sinners, and Jesus says, you don't know how lost you are. And he's not talking about people who need Jesus. He's talking to these Pharisees. And he's saying, you're like a lost coin, but guess what? I'm going to come find you. And he's like, you're like a lost sheep, but I'm going to leave these ones who are already here eating because they're not dumb, and I'm going to go find you. And by the way, when a shepherd goes and finds a sheep, they don't like play a song and ask them to come to the altar. They throw them over their shoulders and they walk them back home. It's against their will. Right. So if we want to debate free will, let's keep it in the mindset of a shepherd who is like, nah, I'm not going to lose that sheep. But something that I think is extremely important is what comes about later in rabbinic and Mishnaic tradition in Judaism. And this is a quote from an essay on the table in the Jewish home. Rabban Johanan and Rabbi Eliezer both said, while the temple still stood, the altar used to make atonement for a person. But now that the temple no longer stands, a person's table makes atonement. A person's table, representing normal routine, resembles the altar since, like the altar, it atones for him. And so what they're saying is, and this came about basically because of the destruction of the temple, there is no more temple. And so what are we going to do to come before the altar of the Lord? Well, the table is the altar. Man, they couldn't have gotten it more right. This is what it's about. Not this, where one of us has all the lighting and carries the conversation and the microphone, and there's no input, and there's no conversation, and there's no fellowship, and there's no jokes, and there's no, oh my gosh, I can't believe he just said that in public. That is fellowship. This is monologue. No, I'm not going to. That's a horrid joke, and I'm just not going to tell it. No, I will tell it. Jesus tells us to take the monologue out of our eye. Boo. So again, why is this important? What does Deuteronomy 23 say? And this is one of my favorite things to quote. It says, no person with a crushed testicle or a removed member may enter before the assembly of Yahweh. And then it says, no Ammonite, no Moabite, and it lists all these people. And it's like, you can't come into the assembly of Yahweh. And you know why? Because you oppressed us and didn't help us when we were hungry in the desert. Read Deuteronomy 23. It gives you the reason why Israel is so pissed at the Moabites. Okay? But the whole upsetting of all this is that Jesus is a Moabite. Because Ruth. And so it's like, just in his action of sitting down and eating, he's including the Moabites at the altar. And he's going after these people who were formerly disinherited nations. Greeks, people of the house of Israel, religious leaders, Roman supremacists. There isn't anybody who doesn't come under the umbrella of his grace at the table. Anyone, no one. Atheist, faithist, theist, I don't care what you label yourself, the place is set. And it's not just that the place is set and he's kicked back waiting. No, he's out looking for the offensive house to go into. Like, which one is really going to make them mad? Oh, I know. I'll go eat there. And Jesus isn't doing it because he's like us and we like to, oh, I'm a grace person, I can have a beer. He's doing it because he genuinely loves the person on the other side. And he's like, your exclusion doesn't get to apply here. Just because these people are dirty, they don't wash their hands before they eat. I mean, the guy is astonished that Jesus doesn't wash his hands before he eats. The Pharisee is. And he's even mad at him for it. What do we do with a Jesus who not only sits down with the dirty, but presents himself as dirty and doesn't care when people call him such? Hold on there, bucko. I think it's time you really understood who I was. You don't get to say I'm a drunkard and a glutton because I am God or God's son or I am the Lord or I know. He said, this man is a drunkard and a glutton. And he's like, Dude, John came and didn't do anything and you said he's too abstinent. I come and I do everything and you say I'm off my rocker. He's like, which one do you want? And he calls them out on their crap. Can you imagine then if the church today functioned a little bit more like a table and a little bit less like a concert hall? I mean, I realize the irony of saying this up front. Right? It's like critiquing social media on Facebook. Well, duh. No, but you know what? If you're going to have a platform, use it for the right thing. What if church looked more like a table? I have a friend in Michigan that said, what if we demolished our stages and built tables with the wood? You know, what if we were allowed to come together, whatever our stance in life? You'll notice that Jesus never says to any of these people that he's eating with, he never says, look, I'm going to eat with you now, but I can't leave you like I found you. He doesn't say that. He just eats with them and then goes on his way. You know, does that have a profound impact on the people? Yeah, most likely. Most of these people are people who had probably never had a meal with an upstanding Jewish teacher. And here he is. And again, to me, this is important because it says to me, okay, look, if I believe that Jesus is the incarnate God of the universe, and that God comes on the scene and the Logos becomes sarx, like sarx isn't just human. It's flesh. And it's with that attitude. It's flesh. The Word became flesh. Ugh. Like, why would he become that? Because we're all that. You know, the all have sinned idea comes around later with Paul. And I think what Paul's doing is trying to make a real good case for why none of us have any leg to stand on when we want to judge one another. And Jesus does encompass just about everyone, at least everyone who's available in his immediate vicinity. He doesn't leave anyone out. He doesn't use justice as his wall of offense to keep those people out, because look, we have the right scapegoat. It's always the right scapegoat for a time. Like, you kill him, you feel better, and then you realize, oh, my problems didn't go away. I mean, this is history. You just look back. Hitler and the Jews. Kills them all, right? Why? Because they were the problem. And guess what? None of those problems went away. Jesus was the problem, and they killed him, and that problem wiped them out 40 years later. I mean, obliterated Jerusalem. Not a stone of the temple was left. Mothers were forced to eat their children because Israel was under siege. I mean, this is not a pretty picture. And Jesus includes people who were the captain of that army at his table. Man, that's a good point to end on. We're done. Dismiss? Anything else?